Welcome. This is The Deep Dive, a new initiative. I'm Jonathan Hessen, of course, and today we're going to focus on a very important question. Is the West doing enough to contend with terror in the Middle East, terror by non-state actors, state actors? To do just that, let me welcome both our guests. We'll start with Luke Coffey, who's a senior fellow here at Hudson Institute, as well as Peter Rao, who is also a senior fellow and the director of the Center on Europe and Eurasia. It's a pleasure to have you both. Let me start with you, Peter. When you look at the various challenges at hand with the question that we're posing in today's program, is the West doing enough?
Well, apparently not, given the manifold crises around the world spawning from terrorism, be it the Houthis rocketing Red Sea traffic, thereby forcing major global shipping to divert around the Horn of Africa, or be it the twofold terror attacks we've seen in recent months, first in Tehran, then in Moscow, not hitting Western capitals, but nonetheless, those are terror attacks undertaken and prosecuted by organizations which the West had been battling for years and had hoped to eradicate. And so really across Africa as well, in sub-Saharan Africa, where the French and the United States have sought to really try to build state institutions. We've seen failures there. The Russians move in, terrorism rise. I think across the globe and all along the West borders, beginning in the Mediterranean South, across the Middle East, up into Russia, we see terrorism knocking on the doors of Europe. And this is a formidable challenge and one worrying, given, for example, the state of our southern border here in the United States, which has been rather porous. One could easily imagine terrorists, if they're following the news, trying to introduce terror elements across the southern border, and that would be problematic for the U.S. So yeah, no doubt, the West has not done enough, and terrorism has seen a resurgence of late.
Mr. Coffey, do you see the same?
Yeah, I do see the same. We're also failing to evolve in a fast enough manner in how we confront some of these newer challenges. For example, we're using perhaps billion-dollar warships firing million-dollar missiles to take out a missile from the Houthis that maybe costs a couple $100,000 to manufacture. We have to get smarter in how we confront some of these challenges when it comes to transnational terrorism. And we also have to understand that the era in which we live, with the proliferation of technology and the internet and social media, these non-state actors can actually have the impact of a state actor, whether it's Hezbollah or whether it's the Houthis or the so-called Islamic State. What they do on the global stage can have the same impact or feel like the same impact of what a nation state used to have the kind of like the competency of. So this is something that we have to come to grips to as well. We're entering an era of great power competition similar to the 19th century, but this time around we have non-state actors that are empowered to behave like state actors, and that's a big difference.
Let's draw back to one of the pivotal moments, I think, in the war on terror, and that is 9/11. Following 9/11, just roughly 8-9 days after, President at the time, George W. Bush, made a State of the Union address, during which he highlighted very key elements to his foreign policy, and that of a war on terror, something that we saw the British Prime Minister at the time, Tony Blair, visiting, of course, and being there at that address, but also nations, Western nations, and nations from the Western sphere, so to speak, joining and rallying behind the United States in its leadership in the war on terror. During that address, President George W. Bush highlighted a pledge that the United States will lead the Western world in war, a relentless war on terror, and that it will go after not only terror organizations, non-state actors, so to speak, but also state actors, state sponsors of terror, something that today we see the Islamic Republic of Iran, we see Syria still, and other countries in the region exploiting that void, strategic power competition, challenging various intricacies and Western domain. How are we dealing with all those challenges at once, and what has the West, so to speak, done wrong in the course of those 20 years that brought us to date?
Well, that address, September 20th, 2001, was, I think, a high watermark for American unity, at least this millennium, which isn't all that old, but nonetheless, over the past 20, 23 years, the U.S. has rarely been as united as it was then. President Bush's approval ratings inched above 90%. And I dare to say if there were a major terror attack today, I'd be hard-pressed to imagine that we'd have a similar rallying around the president at the same levels that we experienced then. And I think that gets at a basic point and answers your question, which is that one of the fundamental challenges of today is how free and open societies in an era of globalization guard against actors who want to do us harm, whether they be non-state armed groups, but in particular non-state armed groups who famously using the weapon of the weak try to employ terrorism and then move back into the shadows. Whereas states tend to be a little bit more hesitant to use this overtly against superpowers because they themselves have state institutions which can be targeted. So they use proxies. And it's just been very difficult for the West to eradicate these proxies, to eradicate these terror groups, because it is such a formidable challenge. And so here we are today. I think there's a bit of war wariness that's probably crept in. It's been 20 years of an anti-terror campaign, which the U.S. launched in Afghanistan, Iraq, and suddenly moved to other places in the world, Yemen, for example. And we see the news now of someone like Bashar Assad, who was told it's time to go by President Obama, still in power, welcomed back into the Arab League fold. If you can just outlast the U.S., overcome their rhetorical hardline, survive whatever pinprick, even military campaigns they launch against you, eventually the thinking is, we have a longer breath than you. It's the old Taliban adage or Al Qaeda adage that you may have the watches, but we have the time, and that I think is one challenge we have yet really to overcome.
Yeah, well, and following on what Peter was saying about the Taliban, I mean the situation in Afghanistan is a great example of how we can completely derail any sort of sensible policy or sensible approach on the counterterrorism front and just sort of give up, so to speak. When President Biden left Afghanistan in the manner in which he did, he created the conditions where there are now an estimated 20 or more than 20 transnational terrorist groups operating in Afghanistan, operating freely. Senior members of Al Qaeda that hadn't stepped foot in that country for 2 decades are now back there operating freely. A lot of regional terrorist organizations that most in the West don't know much about, like the IMU, for example, the Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, they are very active in Afghanistan. They threaten the broader region.
Which were responsible also for the attack in Moscow.
And of course, the so-called Islamic State Khorasan province is the ISIS branch in Afghanistan. And since the Taliban took over, their numbers have swelled.
So let me ask you on that particularly, because somewhat more than 6 months ago, we had Commander of Central Command, General Michael Kurilla, coming out and saying that within 6 months, Wilayat Khorasan, namely the Islamic State of the Khorasan district, will threaten not only allies and partners in the Middle East, but also allies in Europe, and potentially within 8 to 9 months, it would threaten the homeland, the United States. How do you contend with such a reality when policy is seemingly lacking?
Well, that's the big question, and I think we should take that as a shot across the bow. We lack the ability to keep track of these terrorist organizations in Afghanistan because we don't have that presence on the ground. We can't use the Taliban as a trusting partner when it comes to counterterrorism operations. The United States has very few good relations in Central Asia right now. So Afghanistan, once again, is sort of a blind spot for U.S. Homeland Security. And the Islamic State has proven that it can strike. Moscow is thousands of kilometers away from Afghanistan. Yes, Russia might be an adversary of the West right now, but ISIS has shown that it can strike in a foreign country thousands of kilometers away from its home base. And we should take this very seriously, that if they can do that there, they could probably do it here as well. You had the migrant worker crisis in Russia, where you have impoverished migrant workers living on the fringes of society that got quickly radicalized that launched this terrorist attack. Peter mentioned to the chaos at our southern border. It wouldn't take much to sneak across the border, and we could have, God forbid, a similar situation here. So it should be considered a wake-up call.
Mr. Rapp?
I also think that we should be honest about the policy trade-offs which we are taking. And when President Biden decided to go through with a full and complete withdrawal from Afghanistan, there was a lot made by the administration of this concept of over-the-horizon platforms. The distance, owing to those relatively weak relations we have in Central Asia, from say Qatar, an American base, to be able to surveil and potentially strike terror units in Afghanistan, are enormous. And without the human intelligence, the on-the-ground presence, we learned during the counterinsurgency campaigns in Iraq and in Afghanistan that it's almost impossible to really know what the kind of anthropological map of the land is. So,
but where was the disconnect? Because I remember quite vividly CIA Director William Burns coming out and warning that the withdrawal would have an impact on the capacity to have concrete intelligence of the situation in Afghanistan. General Kenneth McKenzie, the commander of CENTCOM at the time, he not only at the time warned the policymakers and President Biden himself, who took that decision ultimately, that a contingency was necessary in order to ensure that such a threat would not arise.
Well, I think anybody who's spent some time in Washington knows that President Biden, of really almost anyone in the national political leadership, has been dead set on getting out of Afghanistan for quite some time. So this was a decision that was ingrained in his DNA. Wasn't privy to the interagency process or the debates taking place in the Oval Office, but I can imagine that his closest aides, be it Tony Blinken at the State Department or Jake Sullivan, his national security advisor, both of whom know him going back years, were operating within clear set parameters and lines that the president had established, which is to say, we're leaving Afghanistan. How do we do this best? Then subsequently, to the point I was trying to make, I think there was a public defense of that decision by arguing we can, from an over-the-horizon position and vantage point, still maintain some vestige of stability in Afghanistan. And I just don't think that's borne out by the facts. Moreover, I think we have to distinguish between interventions, size and scope, phases they're in, et cetera. The American position and footprint in Afghanistan was never large in its early phases. I think that's quite frankly why early on in the intervention in Iraq, the U.S. decided to go in with a light footprint, because it had worked in Afghanistan. For an entirely different reason, it didn't quite work out in Iraq the way it had early on in Afghanistan. But by the time President Biden took the decision to take all troops out of Afghanistan, we weren't amassing height of the Iraq war style numbers in Afghanistan. The expense was relatively cheap. For the bang for the buck was good. And the mortality rates were way down for U.S. forces. So I think this was something he had just decided on. Anecdotally, when you speak to people who interact with the president, be it when he was VP and had traveled to Pakistan, Afghanistan, he had this file a little bit as vice president, which President Obama had not entirely surrendered to him, but which he had bound in Vice President Biden quite a bit. He thought that he was getting, I think, incomplete assessments of the situation, and he really wanted to get out.
Much of the discussion in Europe that ensued was very damaging to the perception of unity in the West, particularly picked up in that manner by adversaries of the US-led North Atlantic Alliance, particularly, namely the Russian offensive or war of aggression in Ukraine was the culmination thereof, or so it's perceived in Europe today, here in the US as well, within a number of circles. But when we're looking ultimately at the implications that ensued from the various challenges at hand, of course, we know what ensued in the European front vis-a-vis Ukraine, but nonetheless, the US is still leading a certain effort vis-a-vis Iran. And that effort is done in cooperation, collaboration with European allies and partners. And it seems that even though, for instance, you've been an advisor in the UK, and we hear that the UK is quite clear-eyed about the threats emanating out of the Islamic Republic of Iran, it's unwilling to break the American policy role in dealing with the Iranian threat because it is more concerned about maintaining the relations in a coherent policy strategy vis-a-vis matters that the United States should take the lead in.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. That's a very good assessment of the situation, and it's unfortunate because countries like the United Kingdom have enough clout and respect in the city, in Washington D.C., where they could maybe move the needle a little bit on certain policy issues. But ever since the Taliban took over in Afghanistan, this has been a shot in the arm to transnational terrorist groups all around the world. They have been able to recruit in ways otherwise not possible. And it allowed many of our adversaries to challenge and test U.S. and Western resolve in a way that otherwise would not have been possible. And it's no coincidence that many of the attacks by Iran and Iranian proxies across the Middle East against U.S. targets and our allies in the region have occurred after the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, when the Biden administration refused to deal with Iran in a very forceful manner. But then at the same time, many of our friends and partners and allies around the world started to question U.S. resolve on the big security issues. And I do believe that the road that led to the invasion of Ukraine first stopped in Kabul. Vladimir Putin sensed weakness and indecisiveness by the White House, and he acted. And it's a very good thing that the Ukrainians put up such a stiff resistance early on. In many ways, that saved the West. Because imagine a situation in the world where just 6 months after the world was watching Afghans fall off C-17s as they were flying out of Kabul airport, that then the Russians were parading down the capital of Kyiv. That would have been a major blow to Western resolve and commitment. So in a way, the Ukrainians gave the West some breathing space to try to get back on track. The question is, are we taking this opportunity? Are we getting back on track? Or are we continuing down this path of denial where we fool ourselves into thinking that, oh, it's just all going to be okay, but really it's not going to be?
Mr. Rao, the British Chief of Defense recently highlighted that the sacrifice Ukraine is making is buying the West time. The question is, at a time when Western civilization, under leadership of the United States particularly, but European nations as well, understand this, and this is embedded to a certain degree within policymaking, within European capitals, how can the various activities not further insert a certain urgency to contend also with bad actors that are not only creating plenty of challenges throughout the Middle East, particularly speaking about the Islamic Republic of Iran. We see, as you mentioned initially, the Red Sea, but also Iraq, Libya, not Libya, but also Libya, but specifically Lebanon, Syria. We're seeing the situation, the deployments along the border with Jordan, the insurgency that is happening in multiple occasions, but also the war in the Gaza Strip with the Islamist Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad. All of that, and the Iranians are not touched. At the same time, the Iranians are also sending weapons, particularly to Ukraine or to Russia, to help stimulate the Russian offensive against Ukraine. Where is this coming from, and why is there no true resolve to contend with the Iranian threat?
Well, for starters, I would say that when Luke says the road to the Russian intervention in Ukraine stopped in Kabul, or was in part at least accelerated by what Putin saw as fecklessness in American policy in Afghanistan, generally applies to the, let's call it, the era of counterterrorism and then great power competition, in the sense that our failures in the campaign against terror is what's given us the era of great power competition. It's no coincidence that there are multiple crises heating up around the world at once. It was always going to be this way, which is to say, as bad actors view the distribution of power as shifting in the international system, as they think the United States to be no longer as dominant as it was, to possess a surfeit of power so it could tamp down crisis wherever it wanted, they're taking their shots. And they're all perceiving this weakness at the same time, hence they're moving at the same time. This, I think, is what's spawning this kind of global axis of revisionists that's formed: Iran, Russia, DPRK, one could put Venezuela in this group, of course, all backstopped by the economic power of China. And the West needs to view this as one broad, I think, confrontation that we've now sort of slithered into or fallen into, owing to our failures in part over the last several decades. As to the particular question of Iran, I don't think that perceptions of unity are as important as perceptions of American strength. So had the United States, and quite frankly, I don't think the problems in Afghanistan were that the Europeans were on a different page than us. It's that we basically failed in the enterprise and in the exercise. Had we shown to be tougher, had a steel jaw, and held our own, I think that would have had a bigger impact than all of us deciding together that we're going to withdraw and the war in Afghanistan ending poorly. But basically, I think there is an ideological difference, and you feel it in Washington between, and I think this is generally true, it's a bit of a caricature, but left and right on the Middle East. The progressive left believes that you can build a condominium in the Middle East, articulated in President Obama's famous phrase of all the actors sharing the region, Iran, Saudi Arabia, etc. Whereas the Republican view, the conservative view, has generally been that we have traditional allies, Israel, the Gulf states, the Turks, Egypt, etc. And Iran is an opponent of that order. And so our job is to strengthen our partners and allies and try to weaken Iran. There's no other region in the world where I think there's as much of a whipsaw effect or a whiplash effect between left and right as there is in the Middle East. I mean, in the Indo-Pacific, there's a lot of continuity between the Trump and Biden administrations. In Europe, there are certain institutional structures that just create a mental map. NATO, for example. Russia has traditionally been hostile to us. It's a bit easier for us to understand that. But in the Middle East, I think the left has really, quite frankly, departed from the post-1979 theory of containment of Iran. And they think that we need to pull back. And by pulling back, we have to build a partnership. Whereas conservatives oftentimes want to pull back as well, but at least they recognize the importance of building up Israel, the Gulf states, the Turks as kind of a counterbalance.
Mr. Coffey, when we're looking at the Red Sea particularly, we're seeing the United States leading two coalitions, Task Force 153, Operation Prosperity Guardian, if I'm not mistaken, and then you have another U.S.-led coalition to contend on the offensive aspect of things, of course, with the U.S. contributing the largest contingent of both naval as part of NAVCENT forces, and the Brits are also providing some aerial offensive tools with some staff officers from Canada, Australia, the Netherlands, and of course with the Bahraini being the stage of operation, so to speak. And then you have another EU force that includes Germany and other countries within that aspect that seems to be more of a insurance aspect for vessels to trade through that territory or waterway to be able to diminish the costs. But if you look at the big picture, you already saw the Hessen vessel, particularly, launch a surface-to-air missile towards an American MQ-9. There are different mistakes emerging out of there. Why not just do everything under one contingent called NATO and be done with it?
Well, I completely agree. And in fact, I wrote an article during the first week after these missions were announced last fall, stating just this: we need to learn the lessons of the counter-piracy operations around 2009, 2010, 2011, where you had a U.S. coalition of the willing, the CTF 151 mission. You had a NATO mission. You had an EU mission. Then you had some countries that sort of just showed up and did their thing and then left again. There was no formal command structure or coordination between these different maritime commands. And I wrote exactly what you just described. We need to have one mission led by one commander that can confront all the different aspects of this challenge. Having America's allies in NATO pick and choose kind of which mission they want to do is a recipe for failure, in my opinion. Another lesson from the counter-piracy operations that we should have learned earlier on when it comes to the Red Sea is that in the same way you cannot fight piracy just at sea, you have to hit the logistics and the bases on land. we waited too long before we were hitting Houthi targets and Houthi sites on land. And now it seems like this isn't going anywhere. We still hear every single week a new ship has been attacked, a new drone has been shot down. And so we need a more coherent and strategic process when it comes to fighting a non-state actor like the Houthis.
We'll have to revert to this topic and discuss it more thoroughly from a European angle. In 2-3 sentences, each of you, where are we looking at in the near future? What should we focus on? Mr. Rowe, we'll start with you.
Well, I would say that we should prioritize checking those states which provide the resources, materiel, ideology, diplomatic backing, et cetera, for these non-state armed groups. And that really is still the organizing principle of global politics. State actors matter the most. And if you really counter the state actors, you can therefore begin to at least work against these non-state armed groups.
Mr. Coffey?
And we need American leadership. We need American leadership to convene and get like-minded allies and partners on the same sheet of music to achieve a common goal. And without that full American leadership, we are not going to accomplish goals like keeping the Red Sea open to commercial shipping.
Mr. Rao, Mr. Coffey, thank you so very much. I'd like to thank all of you at home. Until our next episode, from here in Washington, have a good evening.
For more of TV7's productions and editorials, we invite you to visit our website at www.tv7israelnews.com.
My name is Doron Gavish, and my background 30 years of serving in the Israeli Air Force. My last job I was the commander of the Israeli Air and Missile Defense during the introduction of the Iron Dome to the defense of Israel. All of this allows me really to be part of the team here in TV7. It is super important to have such a platform. We talk about the global situation, we talk about Israel and those different angles which are relevant to the discussion.